Stephen Straley.
And what's your date of birth?
7/21/1950.
And do you know that you're being video recorded?
I do.
Okay, where were you born?
I was born in Englewood, New Jersey. My parents were from West Virginia, and my dad spent 2 years in New York. He worked for the DuPont company, and he spent 2 years in New York. And during the years he was in New York, I was born in New Jersey, and then he went back to West Virginia.
So were you raised in West Virginia?
Not for long. I was pretty young. My father worked for DuPont, and he was transferred to Wilmington, Delaware, which is the home of the DuPont company. He was an executive for DuPont for his entire career. And anyway, he had, so we went to Wilmington, Delaware after. So New Jersey, then West Virginia, then Wilmington, Delaware.
And when did you first get exposed to the outdoors?
Well, it wasn't really my folks. They were not huge on the outdoors. They were both, my dad grew up in a tiny town in West Virginia. My mother grew up in Charleston, and their dreams were living in a big city and taking, advantage of all the cultural things. My mother's half-sister went to New York City as a model and as a dancer for the ballet company, the New York Opera. And so my mother's orientation was also New York. She went to a secretarial school there right around the end of the 30s. And so anyway, my exposure to the outdoors came later when I was about 10 or 12. We used to go back to West Virginia, and we'd see my great uncle Tommy, who lived actually on an island at the confluence of the Elk River and Blue Creek. And my family had run it, although Tommy's father was a lawyer, and there were lawyers going back. That desk right there is an 1840s lawyer desk from the family. So anyway, lawyers back a ways until Tommy, and they had run a resort, which back in the day, you didn't travel far to vacation. People would leave their homes in Charleston and go out to this resort, which was about 18 miles away, and they would stay, and there were horses and a pack of dogs. And
well, what was your Uncle Tommy's last name?
Thomas Snyder Hall.
And what was the resort?
It was just called the Island Inn. And anyway, so when we would go back, we would go visit Tommy on the island. And at the time, it hadn't been an inn for 40, 50 years. And it had fallen into disrepair. Tommy was a bachelor and lived there by himself, but it was great. And when we would go, what was cool for us is we'd pull up, and then we'd have to go down to the landing, and we'd have to call or blow a horn until Tommy heard us. Then he'd pull a skiff over to the landing and take us back over to the island. And my parents would occasionally, what they would do is they'd drop us off with Tommy, and then they go into Charleston, see all my mother's old friends. And then what would happen is we'd stay with Tommy, which was an experience, because there was no indoor plumbing in the island, and we'd wash in wash basins, and he made us fold our clothes and put them at the foot of our bed. And when we asked him why, he says, in case of a fire, you grab everything and go, things that we'd never experienced, really didn't experience much. But he'd take us out, and he had a pack of beagles, and we'd go out with his friend, the name's not coming to me. Anyway, we'd go out, and he'd light a fire, and we'd let the dogs run, and when they'd bring something to bay, he'd call them off. And
do fishing?
Yeah, we'd fish around the island. Tommy hand-built us a canoe, which, because my younger brother and I, our birthdays were pretty close, he gave to my brother and I both as, a present. And when it came to the end of the summer and we wanted to load it up and take it back with us, my dad would sit there and confab and tell me, well, yeah, we haven't got a place to put it, I can't get it on the car, da 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 da. It wasn't until 10 years later we figured out that Tommy had given this canoe to every one of the cousins that ever came to the island. You know, every kid below the age of 10 that showed up was given the canoe. This is your canoe, you know, and nobody ever put it together, you know. So, but Tommy would agree reluctantly to keep it. You know, after this discussion with my dad, we go, well, Tommy, can you keep it for us? You know, and he goes, yeah, sure, you bet, we'll keep it for you. You know? And so he'd put it up until the next young great nephews would show up, and then he'd give them the canoe. And
well, where'd you go to school in high school?
I went to high school in Wilmington. So
in Delaware, you still
Delaware.
moved over there, but you still went back out to the island once in a while?
Yeah, we did. My last trip there, I was 19, and you know, we went out and saw, and you know, kind of an interesting story that I've told before, but just to go to show you West Virginia the way it was. Uncle Tommy's father, the guy who was a lawyer, was crippled with polio. He had polio as a youth and he couldn't get around. So he had some concerns about his boy being, you know, growing up with the knowledge of the woods and everything. So he went to a character that he knew who lived in the hollow beyond the other side, not the landing that we came in, but where the old bridge was to the island that was no longer there. Anyway, he went up the hollow, and he had helped this guy secure his land claim. The guy had, you know, his family had homesteaded it 150 years ago, but they never had clear title. And so he helped negotiate the title for the guy, and the guy, because he was a lawyer and because this guy was his neighbor, he did it gratis. And so he went and talked to the guy. He said, I'd like your son to watch my boy, because I'm crippled, I can't get around the woods. And they shook hands on it. And this had to be in the 1910. When I was there in 1969, for the last time that I saw Tommy, this Hillman's son had walked down from Clendenin, which was maybe 5 or 6 miles, crossed over in the island in the skiff, and walked up, mounted the steps. There were about 100 steps up to the top, and stopped and saw Tommy and my brothers and I sitting on the porch, and he waved and turned around and walked away. And 59 years later, he was still doing what his dad told him, which was to watch Tommy for
Wow.
Mr. Hall.
That's
And
cool.
I wish I could remember his name. It'll pop around in there, but he
That's
was.
cool.
So he was still watching them, and they went to Russia together in the 20s. That's who he took with him. And this guy was always on his cruise, repressurizing oil wells and the other stuff.
That's what Tommy did?
That's what Tommy did. Yeah, basically he had patents on a thing for repressurizing wells using the steam engines that they used to pump oil. And it was kind of funny. Tommy would, he'd have his portrait taken, and he looked like one of these guys in the oil fields, kind of roughneck, kind of not well shaved, old pork pie hat, and coveralls and everything. But for his pictures, for photographs, Tommy would always be wearing a pair of just pure white gloves. And he'd be standing there with the crew around him, or so he'd be somewhere in the picture with a set of white gloves that he would display to show that he was the boss.
Huh.
And that he was, and I think he might have done it for his mother, because his mother worried that he was hanging out on rough company, But I have a portrait of Tommy that's great. It just shows him at the island, sitting on a chair in front of an old sycamore tree. And he's just kind of in a suit with a celluloid collar and everything, just kind of calmly looking at the camera. But on the back, it says, I give you Chasley Rawson III, 3 guns, 2 dogs, a gentleman. And that's how he signed it.
Oh, he darn.
And his mother's name was Susan Rawson. So I think the joke Chasley Rawson III was for his mother. He was always making jokes with his mother. So, anyway.
So when you turned 19,